Hello. You can't trust anybody. They told me it was full. And I can see empty seats up there. I reckon I blame the snow, don't you? Everybody who can has gone to the snow, but they're probably warmer than we are here. Now then, it's been a very strange few days for me. You know that I've been personally attacked, my motives have been impugned, and I do that thing that we all do where we think, was I insensitive? Did I get it wrong? Were there mistakes I could have avoided? Did my antennae fail me? And it's begun to change in the last 2 days when I've talked to people who know what I'm talking about and who recognise what I'm saying and who find it helpful, because it was never meant to be destructive or skullduggerous. But you know, when the Murdoch press rings you up and says, oh, you know, that ageing loon Germain Greer has just said whatever they think I said, and some poor person's knee jerks and they say what they would say if indeed I had said that, we end up going down the veil of error until we disappear into complete misprision and misunderstanding. The misprision and misunderstanding has gone on for too long. We are going to have to sit down and listen. But before we can sit down and listen, we have to have deserved to be talked to be told how much it hurts. And it's humiliating to confess things like that. And we have not yet deserved to hear it. Now, you were promised tonight that I would reflect on the uses of rage in achieving social change, and its waste when it's misdirected, its mythology and its history. You've also been told that someone out there thinks that anger is my octane. I had to Google octane. I realised that I too thought that octane was kind of like a fuel additive that would give you extra mileage. And of course that isn't what it is at all, as the boys could have told us. What it ought to mean, if I have high octane, it should mean that I have a high tendency to auto-ignite. So don't be surprised if I burst into flames. But I rather fancy that what was meant was that I have low octane. The more octane or equivalent a fuel has, the greater its resistance to auto-ignition. So if I have high octane, I don't rise to every bait that is trailed across my path. I consider that I have behaved with saintly patience this week. Now, I don't point this out because I'm beside myself with fury, but because the esteemed commentator who feels entitled to sum up what he takes to be my motive force doesn't know diesel from petrol. Whatever you do, don't lend him your car. Rage, however, is a serious subject. I want to make it clear to you that it's not the same as indignation, or contempt, or disgust. Because all of those feelings position you with regard to the subject. Indignation, you assert your authority to criticise and condemn. Rage is not irritation, or even irritability, or even bad temper. It's not ire or wrath. It is beyond all these things. Rage is blind and speechless. Someone like me, who spent her whole life explaining herself to my students, to my readers, to my public, cannot be afflicted with rage. Rage cannot do that. Rage doesn't even want to explain itself. Anyone who pleads, argues, expounds, demonstrates, has to be moved by love and optimism. It doesn't matter how testy you get, the fact that you're still talking, that you're still explaining, means that you have faith in the person who's listening to you. You believe that truth will eventually triumph. Even though you are misunderstood virtually all the time, and sometimes really mischievously, you go on believing that there's a point in what you're doing. He that has ears to hear, let him hear. Rage is what happens when you stop believing that there is any point. Rage doesn't just push you to hurt other people. Rage puts the shotgun in your mouth and blows your head to smithereens. If you write, as I do, for a living, you have to be well within yourself. You can't be beside yourself. If your energy has been wasted in getting mad, foaming at the mouth, gnashing your teeth and seeing red, there's nothing creative you can do. Whatever we do in a state of rage will be destructive. As Shakespeare says, or rather as someone else says in Richard II, in rage we are deaf as the sea, hasty as fire. I love deaf as the sea. Now, you want to know it's true that rage affects social change. Here's how it does it. And again, it's Shakespeare. The gates of mercy shall be all shut up, and the fleshed soldier, rough and hard of heart, in liberty of bloody hand shall range, with conscience wide as hell, mowing like grass your fresh fair virgins and your flowering infants. What is to me then, if impious war, arrayed in flames like the prince of fiends, do with his smirched complexion all fell feats enlinked to waste and desolation? What rein can hold licentious wickedness when down the hill he holds his fierce career? We may as bootless spend our vain command upon the enraged soldiers in their spoil, as send precepts to the Leviathan to come ashore. The person speaking, as I'm sure you know, is Henry V, describing what would happen if he sent his soldiers in to sack the town of Harfleur. It was a con. His soldiers were too weak, too hungry, and too ill to have been able to wreak such havoc. But there are plenty of examples of such horrors of warfare carried out against a civilian population in the history of 16th century warfare. And of course there are even more in the 20th century. War is institutionalized rage. Shakespeare's heroic commander here admits that once he unleashes his soldiers in their rage, he will be entirely unable to prevent atrocity. What he describes is what happens whenever the blunt instrument of war is unleashed. The rape of Nanjing, the massacre at My Lai, the savagery in Rwanda, the vileness of Abu Ghraib, all are only to be expected. And any pretense that war doesn't do these things, that there's such a thing as a clean and tidy, law-abiding war, is a lie, and we should resist it. It is easier to move the soldier to unreasoning rage against the enemy because he is already terrified. Blind rage and utter terror affect the human organism in identical ways. Henry begs the citizens of Harfleur to surrender, and he is here describing what happens in the black rain of rage. If not, he says, if you don't surrender, why, in a moment look to see the blind and bloody soldier with foul hand defile the locks of your still shrieking daughters your fathers taken by the silver beards and their most reverend heads dashed to the walls, your naked infants pitted upon pikes. Once the soldier has experienced being high on rage chemicals, they can be triggered at will, but once triggered, they can't be controlled. You can turn rage on, but you can't turn it off. And this is what Henry is saying to the civilians in Harfleur. Don't make me do this, because I won't be able to control what happens next. In his remarkable book, Among the Thugs, a book that has had far less success than it should have had, Bill Buford describes what happens when armies of football hooligans go on the rampage. He describes how the horde of men and boys would surge aimlessly up and down the streets, shouting and kicking bottles, waiting for something to go off. Often nothing went off, and the fans milled around aimlessly. When whatever it was did go off, innocent bystanders got bashed and even killed, as the hooligans laid into total strangers with boots and fists and weapons. Alcohol and other stimulants played a role, as they do in warfare. Buford was horrified to realise that after a time, the more time he spent with the hooligans, the more he felt himself responding, being drawn into this atmosphere as his own noradrenaline started pumping. He quit before he was implicated in any act of blind violence, but by then he understood how that could happen even to an educated man like himself. Armies are built on the premise that rage can be induced and manipulated. Be careful what you wish for if you wish for the return of national service. I should know because I live near an English garrison town, and there the squaddies regularly terrorise the civilian population, using their training to inflict better and graver injuries on civilian boys. And it's quite interesting that when the police are called, they almost never prosecute the squaddies. So there is a vein of poisonous rage that is exploited by civil society. Militarism takes the vulnerability of human beings to both terror and rage and incorporates it into a system. Each year we encounter instances of the vileness of the procedures by which this transformation is effected. They include systematic humiliation and abuse of junior personnel, initiation ceremonies, bullying at all levels. At Deep Cut Barracks in Surrey, 4 recruits have died of gunshot wounds. One of them, who died in 1995, had been continually abused verbally and physically, attacked by a gang wearing gas masks as he slept, and thrown through a window after answering an officer back. His body exhibited 5 bullet wounds, only 1 from close range, yet the verdict remains suicide. The one woman among the 4, who was shot through the forehead 6 months later, was said to have been forced to have sex with an officer. The bullet that was in her head has since gone missing. Sound familiar? The suicides or murders are all dots on the trajectory of rage, as it is exploited by the military establishment. I don't have to remind you, I hope, of the psychological devastation that has driven Australian servicemen returning from Afghanistan to do away with themselves. In the United States, 16 army recruiters have killed themselves since 2000. The usual explanation is post-traumatic stress disorder. The soldiers were all being treated with antidepressants. Depression is by far the commonest mental illness. Very few of the vast number of depressed people in our societies will shoot or hang themselves. What is being overlooked in the pathology of in dealing with these cases is the pathology of rage itself. Rage is addictive. People dependent on rage body chemicals cannot settle down. They cannot just get over being poisoned for months on end by rage come terror. Suicide has always been more common among soldiers than amongst the civilian population, as rage is engendered in them by a culture of systematic humiliation and then deployed in acts of extreme violence and cruelty in the field. We really can't be surprised if they shoot or hang or drown themselves or cut their own throats. Though most of the recent army suicides had been on medication, none, I think, took the comfortable route of a drugs overdose. The level of violence involved in soldier self-destruction should be treated as an important clue to its etiology. And the four-letter word I use for that is rage. Now, when I talk to you like this, you can see that I don't think rage is an Aboriginal monopoly. I just think that if you treat people in a certain way, rage is what you'll get. And if you are tyrannical, you can deploy it, you can use it, you can abuse it. But we are not tyrannical, are we? Wouldn't we wish to heal this thing, to deal with this poison? The most dangerous kind of rage has been called implosive rather than explosive. In the person who cannot let his rage burst out, for whatever reason, timidity, lack of opportunity, culture, self-repression, it builds up to toxic levels that can be lethal. It is rage that sends kids into schools with automatic weapons to massacre their schoolmates. 3/4 of the school shooters in the United States had been bullied. Let's have a think about some of these case histories. The perpetrator of the high school shooting at Pearl, Mississippi in October 1997 gave this text to a friend. "I am not insane. I am angry. I killed because people like me are mistreated every day. All throughout my life, I was ridiculed, I was beaten, always hated. It was not a cry for attention. It was not a cry for help. It was a scream of agony." Cho Seung-hui, who killed 5 faculty and 27 students and then committed suicide at Virginia Tech in April 2007, is described as having almost never opened his mouth. As soon as he started reading, the whole class started laughing. He is said to have suffered from something called social anxiety disorder, which resulted in an inability to speak, or mutism. I'm sure you're making the connections in your own imagination as I speak to you. School shootings are sometimes called rage uprisings, and I discover with horror that school shooters are actually popular with kids. There are many internet sites which celebrate them, to which kids send blogs expressing their rage at being pushed from pillar to post and having no possibility of explaining their own situation or why it is that they choose eccentric ways of reacting. One case that interests me particularly is the case of Jeffrey Wise, the perpetrator of the killings at Red Lake, Minnesota in 2005. He described his life as 16 years of accumulated rage, suppressed by nothing more than brief glimpses of hope, which have all but faded to black. He shot and killed 7 people, injured 14, and then killed himself. Wise was a Native American, an Ojibwe. When Jeffrey was 9, his father committed suicide after a day-long standoff with police. He was then living with his alcoholic mother in Minneapolis, St. Paul. When she suffered severe head injuries in a drink-drive accident resulting in permanent brain damage, she was hospitalized, and 11-year-old Jeffrey was sent back to the Red Lake Reservation to live with his grandfather, who was the first person he killed on that terrible day in March 2005, along with his partner. A reservation worker said, "There's a lot of that kind of loss and devastation here." And you will hear similar kinds of statements about what pass for reservations, open-air prisons, if you like, in this country. Red Lake has not a little in common with Palm Island. We are all, I hope, familiar with the work of Chloe Hooper, who won a Walkley Award for her articles on the death of Cameron Doomadgee in the Palm Island police station in March 2004. Helen Garner has described Hooper's book on this subject as the more moving for its intense restraint. Intense restraint is almost an oxymoron. What is being restrained in Hooper's telling is not simply grief and horror, but rage, her own and other people's. She speaks of Elizabeth Doomadgee, Cameron's elder sister. She seemed haughty, as if controlling just a steady rage. Part of Elizabeth's control mechanism is her Christian religion, which lies like a stone slab over the lifetime of suffering that has brought her from the jail she was born in to the open-air prison of Palm Island. Elizabeth knows from the start that there will be no justice for her brother. Though she has never expected anything different, her self-control cracks when the verdict exonerating Senior Sergeant Chris Hurley comes down, and she aims a blow at a social worker's car windscreen with her blunt machete. As a result of that one crack in her armor, she lost all the children who lived with her: grandchildren, great-nieces, and foster children. They were all taken into care. Chloe Hooper is also aware of the rage of the white men on Palm Island. And this is what I have been accused of stirring up and in some way justifying. She writes of Hurley in the courtroom. Penned there, he looked rotten, as if there was something poisonous inside him. You could almost see the bitter rage rocking in his head. His brother shared this rage and expressed it in a wildly intemperate article in the Police Union Journal. But you understand how this rage is born in a situation as unjust as Palm Island, where it is literally impossible to do the right thing. No matter how hard people like Chris Hurley work, and there's no doubt that he did, to bring order into black communities, the black communities over which they were placed in authority, no matter what sacrifices they made, their lives were not easy. But the Aboriginal people continued to resist them, continued to malfunction, denied them what they longed for: respect, recognition, gratitude. And it's too much to ask of anybody, And you know, if you're thinking intervention, you're going to make more of these cases, more of people ripping up their own lives to try and heal a situation that cannot be healed because we haven't actually begun to treat the underlying problem. Chloe Hooper describes the passive resistance of Aboriginal people. Black communities were the opposite of white communities. This is what they're showing by their misbehaviour. Black communities were the opposite of white communities on purpose. "I'm no white man," said the Doomadgee kid who didn't bathe. It was as if the locals were saying, "You think we're all abject? Well, here's what abject is. Here is chaos and self-destruction, unreason and cruelty." And that same pattern can be found in every continent on this planet, where hunter-gatherer peoples have had their lives rendered completely meaningless by colonisation. No matter how many white idealists wind up working to improve the situation on Palm Island, or how hard or how long they work, the resistance of the Aboriginal people will not lessen. White people who devote their lives to serving black people expect to be trusted, loved, honoured and respected, when at best they are simply tolerated. Hooper struggles to be even-handed. She's worried perhaps that some fool might say that anger was her octane and question the reliability of her testimony. But grief and indignation pulse beneath her careful prose. Here is her description of the parallel careers, very restrained indeed, of Hurley and Doomadgee. When Hurley was doing rugby training at a Christian Brothers school, Doomadgee was in a youth and detention centre. By the time Hurley was setting up a sports club for the kids on Thursday Island, Cameron had a child and a broken relationship. As Hurley picked his way along the police career path, the other man was like his shadow. But the bitter joke of reconciliation in Australia is that the lives of these two men were supposed to be weighed equally. Now, you know, if I said that reconciliation was a bitter joke, it would probably be put down to my habitual bad temper and my anti-Australianness. Is there any chance that I would be understood to be merely speaking the truth? It is the truth, after all. I'll say it again, as coolly and as calmly as you like. Reconciliation in Australia is a bitter joke. Somehow, we have to confront and deal with the problem of rage. Now, in the grip of rage, you know, you can't sit quiet as you work on a letter to the editor. You can't even speak. In the grip of rage, you kick the wall and break your foot. The farmer who puts the shotgun in his mouth and pulls the trigger isn't suffering from depression. He is demented with rage. Its cousin is despair, but despair cannot drive violent hands. If anger is to be useful rather than destructive, it must be recollected in tranquility. Tranquility is not available to people whose lives are poisoned with helpless rage. They cannot perform rage. For them, rage is not histrionics, but a hard reality that knots their guts and robs them of the few and inadequate words they have. Those of us who opted for satire in the 60s protected ourselves from the corrosive action of rage by turning our contempt to laughter. You won't find too many Aboriginal people doing stand-up or penning obscene comic strips. When we do, we'll be getting somewhere. Now, the performance of rage is interesting, and it has a function. Let's take the example of the erstwhile pastor of everybody's darling, Barack Obama. When the Reverend Jeremiah A. Wright Jr. stands up before his congregation at the Trinity United Church of Christ on Chicago's South Side, he is ready to perform rage. After 9/11, he roared, America's chickens are coming home to roost. He rewrote God Bless America as God Damn America. Reverend Wright is variously described as fiery, noisy, caustic, incendiary, harsh, blunt, my soul brother. And yet Reverend Wright's church is the preferred worshipping place of Chicago's buppies, the black and upwardly mobile, which is why the Obamas worship there. Wright performs righteous rage for his congregation. He vituperates, execrates, excoriates, hurls imaginary fire and brimstone, erupts like a volcano. But what shakes him is artificial rage, rage as an art form, as unlike real rage as the haka is unlike real fighting. His is a rage dance rather than rage itself. The performance has to be believable. He really has to pound his fist on the pew. His breath must really rasp. His throat sound really raw. His job is to cleave the general ear with horrid speech, make mad the guilty and appall the free, confound the ignorant and amaze indeed the very faculty of eyes and ears. That's Hamlet asking what the great actor would do if he had the cue for passion that Hamlet has. Hamlet is envious of his histrionic ability, his operatic talents. Since the beginning of literature, a certain kind of writer has tried to do exactly that. Satire was invented by Caius Lucilius in the 2nd century BC to lash the vices of his betters. From the outset, the satirist modelled his utterance on the voice of the man possessed by rage, my old friend, who I don't actually know, Bob Catter, making it harsh, spasmodic and spluttering, and they have described their own fictive state in terms of the current notions of the endocrinology of emotion. Juvenal tells us that his parched liver boils with indignation. The satirist uses both salt and gall, rubbing the salt of wit into the wounds on the body politic and spewing bile. As Dryden says, at the beginning of his translation of Juvenal, to view so lewd a town and to refrain, what hoops of iron could my spleen contain? None, bang! The satirist is not frothing and foaming as he writes. His hand must be steady as he takes aim. Anger transmuted becomes a style, a way of drawing, to be mimetically reenacted in the work of art. The caricaturist draws as if he was angry. His pen skates across the page. Everything is swift, bitten, burnt into the page. So the satirist writes as if he is suffering the physiologic effects of rage. You all know this famous quatrain from Donne imitating Horace. Kind pity chokes my spleen, brave scorn forbids those tears to flow that swell my eyelids. I must not laugh or weep sense and be wise. Can railing then cure these worn maladies? When you read that, when you say it, you're aware that your tongue is strenuous. You have to move between these extraordinary positions in the mouth. Chokes my spleen, brave scorn forbids those tears to flow that swell my eyelids, if we're going to make it scan. But it's not meant to scan, it's meant to jerk all over the place. Occasionally you come across a satirist who is a victim of rage, who is so angry that he really cannot, well, at least he's miming a degree of anger that becomes inarticulate. There's a wonderful fragment in the actual handwriting of John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester, in Nottingham University Library, and it goes like this. Now, I need to tell you, I suppose, that Rochester was always in love with the court beauties. He was completely overcome by their glamour. And of course, none of them would look at him. You know why? Because he didn't have any money. Because he was poor. He was dependent on the king's favour. I think he was also a premature ejaculator, but I don't actually know how many of them ever bothered to find that out. So here he writes in the person of someone seeing the woman he adores succumb to a man he hates. She yields, pale envy said, Amen, the first of women to the worst of men. Just so those frailer beings, angels, fell. There's no midway, it seems, twixt heaven and hell. Was it your end in making her to show things must be raised so high to fall so low, since her nor angels their own worth secures? Look to it, gods, the next turn must be yours. You, who in careless scorn laughed at the ways of humble love and called them rude essays. Could you submit to let this heavy thing, artless and witless, no way meriting, end? Can't go on. Becomes speechless with rage. In the satiric world, we have a specific form of writing a fragment in which the rage is meant to actually choke the writer so he can write no more. But it is, of course, an artifice. It's meant to be an obvious ruse. This is Swift on an Irish club. Ye paltry underlings of state, ye senators who love to prate, ye rascals of inferior note who for a dinner sell a vote, ye pack of pensionary peers whose fingers itch for poets' ears, ye bishops far removed from saints, why all this rage? Why these complaints? Why against printers all this noise, this summoning of blackguard boys? Why so sagacious in your guesses? He's talking about the people who are trying to persecute him for writing squibs about them. Why so sagacious in your guesses, your F's and T's and R's and S's? Take my advice. To make you safe, I know a shorter way by half. The point is plain. Remove the cause. Defend your liberties and laws. Be sometimes to your country true. Have once the public good in view. Bravely despise champagne at court, and choose to dine at home with port. Let prelates by their good behaviour convince us they believe a saviour, nor sell what they so dearly bought, this country, now their own, for naught. Ne'er did a true satiric muse virtue or innocence abuse, and 'tis against poetic rules to rail at men by nature fools, but silence. Hest stops, stifled by his own bile. You know, when children have attacks of blind rage, you can't talk to them. You can't reason with them. You can't threaten them. The only thing you can do is try to hold them tight. Try to stop them smashing themselves against things. Try to persuade them that you love them and that their anger is a problem for both of you and doesn't mean that they're a naughty child. When a child has a tantrum, what's going on is the child is performing rage to get a result. The child knows that certain behaviours will produce certain responses. And that's a tactic. A tantrum is a tactic. And a tantrum doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your child at all. But that murderous, silent child who suddenly phases out and goes into a completely unreachable state, that child is in the grip of rage. And when it's over, the child may have no memory of what it did or what it said. It may be ashamed. It may recoil from itself. And everybody has to work hard to help the child overcome the rage, which, we are told in abused children is the outcome of years and years of repeated trauma. Now, what I've argued in my little book is that I set out first the example of Bob Catter, a man whose rage I respect and whose pain is to me only too palpable. And he will tell you why. You can read it in Hansard. It is a Jeremiad and it's tragic. And I respect him. I don't belittle him or laugh at him. I don't call it a spray. I don't say that he spat the dummy because he's not carrying on. You know, it's not that Bob Catter missed the gravy train. It's not that he was left out of a sweet little deal. It's that he is watching the people he's worked all his life to represent destroying themselves because their lives have been destroyed. That's one generation. What if it's been happening for 20 generations? What do you do then? What do you do if you haven't got access to Parliament? Bob Catter was already out of order. He wasn't speaking to the issue. He was trying to land a punch on Warren Truss. But of course, he wasn't supposed to be. He was supposed to be talking to the Drought and Equine Assistance Bill. And everyone just went, oh, here he goes again. And eventually he was told to sit down because his time had run out. But maybe he felt a bit better. Maybe some of the pain was eased. What my little book says is that for the rest of us, alcohol doesn't make us chop up the health centre with axes. Alcohol makes us sleepy or amorous or sick. We might be quarrelsome, we might be bad-tempered, but we're not actually demented and self-destructive and wildly violent. You can't blame the booze. What's happening here is that the booze is unlocking something else, and this is the thing we have to deal with. I don't know how we're going to do it. I don't know if we deserve to be able to do it. What I'm saying is we need a political structure in which rage can be formalized, in which it can be expounded, which we can be given a statement of grievance without humiliating people. The whole thing about the political framework is that you're not making people confess personal weakness. You're able to talk about issues as they affect a whole community. My point, my reason for writing my little book was not, as some people have suggested, to make relations between black and white in this country even more difficult than they are. Why would I want to do such a thing? But like anybody who's seen what's happening, I do believe that Australians are good people. We learnt our egalitarianism from Aboriginal people, I reckon. We believe that everybody is worth the same, and we can't really stand back and watch what is happening in Aboriginal communities and just consign them to oblivion and forgetfulness. Nor can we just take away the women and children, remove them from the sphere of danger and leave the men to destroy themselves. This would be callous in the worst way. I reckon that men really need politics. They need corporate structures. It doesn't matter where you come across them, they will always have some version of that. And for me, the easiest way to go in there is to go with a treaty, to go with a draft treaty, so it can be talked about, man to man, if you like, equal person to equal person, where we have to make ourselves listen, instead of forever telling Aboriginal people what is in their best interest, to listen as they tell us. But remember that we have destroyed their languages. They have no way to speak to each other or to us at the level that we need to communicate. And we have educated them so badly that they don't have the English to do it either. And what is remarkable about the people who are now called Aboriginal leaders is that's the one thing they have, is the gift of the gab. They can talk to us, and they generally use words we like. If we go listen, if we sit on the ground, we're going to have to be patient. It won't come all at once. We might have to wait weeks. before people begin to speak to us. And the words we hear we won't like. They won't be the words that make us feel good. They won't be words that congratulate us. We have to put ourselves, I think, through that discipline. The thing that makes me feel better today, I felt really terrible yesterday because I couldn't sleep. I kept having a long conversation with Marsha, whom I've known for years. I first met her when she worked on the Central Lands Council. She taught me most of what I know. And she was such a wonderful person to be with then, as an activist who was actually winning land claims for Aboriginal people, actually setting them up, actually setting up the arguments, presenting the material, the evidence to judges in chambers and so on. And she was wonderful. And will always be immensely in her debt. And there was I thinking, why would she think that I say these things because I'm racist? Or is she saying that I can't ever be anything but racist? And maybe I can't. I'm a gubba. I'm sorry. I grew up never knowing an Aboriginal person. I'd never seen an Aboriginal person until 1972. And I was born in 1939. That wasn't uncommon in those days. And then today it began to happen. Aboriginal people began to speak to me, and actually it began to happen yesterday. And they were saying, listen, we know what you're talking about. We recognise what you're saying. We think you're on the right track. Don't be disheartened. Keep saying it. People need to hear it. And it comes down to that same thing, that reconciliation is a bitter joke. A bitter joke that nobody's laughing at. And if we don't deal with the rage that smoulders far, far down, then everything will fail. It doesn't matter how much money we throw at it. It doesn't matter what kind of rhetoric we hear. It's going to be very convenient, isn't it? Riding roughshod over the permit conditions, riding roughshod into Aboriginal communities. And I was told today that there are new plans afoot to move whole communities in the Northern Territory because they want to mine uranium. Are we really going to do that again? Are we really going to do that again? Are we going to tell people they have to live in country that's not theirs? I remember the fights that were fought about uranium. I remember hearing an Aboriginal elder saying desperately in what was supposed to be a proper consultation, fuck off, fuck off, fuck off, because she didn't have the words, she didn't have the language, she wasn't a lawyer, she couldn't make a case. All she could say, and that little woman, I seem to recall, was actually thrown in prison because she had apparently spat on somebody or something. She couldn't have hurt a fly. Now we are going, well, she probably could, most Aboriginal women can. Are we going to go there again? This time with a whole new set of buzzwords, and with a whole new set of Aboriginal establishment leaders who will say that it's cool. And communities now have a new problem, which is we have people who can deal with Rio Tinto, who are the chosen spokespeople. Is it all going to happen again? It looks as if it is. Unless we resist, unless we say no, something different has to happen here. We have to start getting messages from the other side. But instead, what do I hear? I hear that there are 50,000 jobs for Aboriginal people in mining. What? That was the idea when the flag first went into the beach. Captain Cook thought these people would make a wonderful workforce. He was wrong. We actually, as it is, second-generation Australians won't work in the mining industry. We've got to import them from all over the place. We suddenly got this idea that, Aborigines would love those 50,000 jobs. And guess what? They can borrow money from the bank. They can have a mortgage and enter into debt slavery. They can be bound hand and foot to the 2-bedroom bloody brick veneer. Please, it's not going to happen. I'll tell you now, it's not going to happen. And the name of the game is resistance. And they have resisted us at such cost to themselves for so long that now we have to understand how the balance sheet really looks. I haven't deserved to have any Aboriginal man tell me where it hurts. And he wouldn't tell me. In writing my little essay, my 10,000 words, I took a huge risk. And I'm still nervous because it was presumptuous. I'm well aware of that, don't you worry. These are cultures that are built on reticence, where people don't spill their guts. That's a great Australian thing that we've all learnt, you know. You don't tell your name to a total stranger. Those people that ring up from Bangalore on the phone, what's your first instinct? Lie to them. Tell them bullshit. Go away. We don't have names or pack drill, and we should understand shyness and reticence in other people. We are a shy people, and we are going to have to be immensely patient, and we haven't been good at any of that. And we're also going to have to be humble. And we might have to be prepared to shed our tears, because it's time we shed them, and not for ourselves.